And we are recording. So do any of you like minor league baseball, like the Birds, Only the Power? Have you guys ever watched one of their games?
Not a big baseball guy, more basketball.
Okay.
Yeah. I like the Darby Birds.
Yeah, I like the different name. Anyway, I don't know if you've seen, but students and faculty and alumni get in free tomorrow if you want to go. I don't know the details, but it should be fine. I would go, but my kids have soccer practice. So.
Pulsating heart. Pulsating heart. Yes, in here, Livey. But I need to.
Let's see. We have Colin, no, excuse me, Bryant, Curry, Darby, Fisher.
Darby.
Darby, okay. With your WVSU stuff, so it's a little bit of extra credit. And of course, if you can stick around for a picture afterwards, a little bit more extra credit. And if you share it later, a little bit more extra credit, so on and so forth. Hamilton, Hellman, Corecus, right? I know you got one of those names like mine, but there's so many different ways you could pronounce it. Corecus? Corecus. Okay. It's Ashley so much better. At least you have Ashley as an option.
Yeah.
My first name is no better than my last name. All right, so you got a little extra credit too for your WVSU here.
So I won't be, me and Sydney won't be here next week because we go to Hawaii. So how will we make up the lab?
Let me think. It's a chemistry lab. I'll come up with a chemistry lab for you since it's an online lab for you since it's an excused absence.
Okay.
And then you can just do that. The only thing really that we need to do that we're going to do here that you couldn't do online is the pH stuff. Like we're going to work with acids and bases. So you'll do some virtual pH experiments. So instead of working with real acids and bases, you're going to be putting like this little animation of putting acids and bases. Anyway, hey, Crystal Miller is here. The WVSU here. Hey, Taylor Miller, right? Yeah. Moody, Newsom, Norris, Popper, Rollins, Ruffin, Saunders, like Shamblin. With WVSU here? Yep. Sherman, Taylor Pierce, Thompson, Valdez, Vargas, Winfield, and Young, right? With WVSU here. For those of you who just walked in, we are recording. So if you have any questions, let me know. If you have anything embarrassing to say, maybe pull it off until after the class. From the top, Bryant. Well, obviously, Bryant. Curry, Fisher, Hamilton, Hellman, Rollins, Saunders.
Yeah.
Gotcha. That's what I'm making. No WVSU here, right? Okay, just checking. Excuse me. So far, everybody's accounted for. So I got a good question about independent work. Glad you're asking now. Did you be surprised that one good question that somebody asked now? It's a good question now. It's a horrible question 10 minutes from now when it's due. But someone was asking about the due date for independent work, right? So your first due date, the first 10, just to have 10 points by this Sunday. And you could technically turn it in Monday night, but I was telling them I recommend, turn it in throughout the weeks, write a little paper, turn it in, all that smaller stuff that you can do for another. So any questions about that? And also as a reminder, for those of you who haven't done it, remember you need to do a Google Doc and share that with me. That's how you turn in independent work, is when you write stuff, that's how you do it. And if you need help just doing that, like use a Google Doc, meet me online or meet me in person for office hours, and I can show you how to do it. Obviously there's videos out there, so you can watch those videos and answer the questions while you watch the video. You get points for that. There's a bunch of articles you can read and like take a little quiz for points. And in that situation, you don't do a Google Docs. You can just like copy the 10 questions, paste it in your email, and send me the correct answers along with the name of the quiz. What else? That same list of articles, obviously you don't have to do a quiz. If you want to, you can summarize it in your own words. Cans. I don't think I've emphasized this enough. You can bring in aluminum cans once a week for 5 points of independent work. It has to be at least a Kroger or at least a grocery bag full, and that to be completely crushed and not leaking. For many reasons. One, if they're not completely crushed and it's not completely full, it'll fly out the back of my truck. That's not good. Two, if it's leaking at all, the janitors or the custodians in this building will not be happy with you, and neither will my wife. Because I take those things home and she gets upset when they leave. So yeah, you can do that once a week. The details are online. It should be. If they're not, I'm gonna make sure they are. All right. Back to attendance. Let's see, Brian? Nope.
No.
Curry. Fisher. Hamilton. Okay, gotcha. You ready to WVSU here? Okay.
You wanted me to remind you about this question that I had yesterday.
Yes, thank you. I'm trying to remember what the question was. It was a good one.
I asked you when the due date was.
Oh, that's right. That's a good question. It goes along with the independent work. So she asked me when the due date was for the study guides, and it's just like independent work, whatever. As long as you get it done, whenever you get it done, you get the points for it. Technically, for example, you could do this chapter 1 study guide after we take the exam, which would be useless to you because it's meant to help you prepare for the exam. But you could technically do it. Yeah, so no due dates on the study guides. I just highly recommend doing them probably right after we finish a chapter, right? Make sure you understood what you just learned. But whatever. Anyway, so we have Hamilton, Hellman. Got you in WVSU gears. That's a little extra credit. Moody, Newsom, Norris, right? Yep. In your WVSU gear. Ford, Rollins, Ruffin. We got Saunders. We got Shamblin. I did get Saunders, right? Saunders is where's Saunders? Okay, yeah, that's great. Making sure. Still trying to do faces and names here. Sherman, Taylor Pierce, Thompson, Valdez, Vargas, Winfield, and we have Bryant just came in WVSU gear. Anybody I miss? We have Vargas. We still have 2 minutes, so if you guys have any questions, let me know. So just a reminder, sorry.
Is there any way you can fix the PowerPoint online?
What's it doing?
We're on chapter 2, but.
Yep.
Okay.
Is it still the old one?
Yeah, it's just skipping right to radioactivity.
Okay, yeah, thanks. I will fix that. Actually, do you mind sending me an email to remind me?
Yeah.
'Cause I say I'll fix it, but first week or two are so busy. Very often stuff like that was in my brain. So thank you for the reminder. Curry? Oh yeah, got you. Curry. We're in WVSU gear? Okay. Fisher? You're in WVSU gear? Okay. Just check. We have about 2 minutes. Is everybody accounted for? Say everybody's name. Speaking of the first week being the hardest, does anybody did you have a tough week last week, anybody? No, everybody's pretty good. That's good. What was the toughest class so far? Not in your career, but last week, was it mine? That's good. I don't strive for it to be. It's just so much information. Rollins? Yeah. What else to remind you of? We have lab today at 10. Off the top of my head, I think everybody did the pre-lab, which is good. Can't do the lab, but in the pre-lab, some of you make corrections. I still need to check those. Got less than a minute for the reminders. So the same way we're doing WVSU Wednesdays every Wednesday, we'll do Red Fridays every Friday if you want to participate in that. Do you guys have any announcements for your athletics or your student clubs or anything? Let me ask you this, for those of you going to Hawaii, how can somebody watch your game without going to Hawaii? Will it be live streamed, you know?
I don't think so.
They should just pay for anybody who wants to go to jail. I'd go for free. All right, it's 8 o'clock. Get started. So again, there's no questions before we get started. Jump back into chapter 2. Close the door. To remind you, we're talking about chemistry. We just got finished talking about the elements that make you up. We talked about the big four: carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen. And I said you need to know those. And we talked about the other 7. Then we talked about the trace elements, 14 of those, none of which you need to know for the exam. But I do think it's interesting. And like I said, I feel like it's a decent independent work topic. It's probably one of the more relevant things in your life, at least the way I presented it. Because there's a lot of people who try to scare you, either because they believe it or because they're just trying to sell something. But a lot of people try to scare you with chemistry, right? Like, oh, this is a scary thing because of its name, or this particular thing is dangerous for you. And it could be, because like I said, on Wednesday, it's all about the dose, right? The dose makes the poison. So some of these things that you have to have in your bodies to survive can kill you. Literally everything can kill you if you have too much of it. So like I was saying, for independent work, feel free to look those things up. You know, how much is too much, how much is not enough. And this iodized salt, have you guys ever wondered what that means? It's because they actually put iodine, like real iodine, in the salt, because we need iodine in our diets. But anyway, this is where we left off. And like I said, if you click this link, there's a video that shows somebody putting a frosted or some kind of cereal into a blender with water, so it's a nice homogeneous mix. And they put a magnet up to this blender, and you can see the metal out of there come out of the cereal. I'm hoping I have 2 videos because I love it. They both show the same thing, but one of them is doing it in like a sciencey way, like, hey, look at me, I'm going to show you this demonstration. Another one's like, they're putting metal in your cereal, and again, they're trying to scare you. People try to scare you with this information, or in that case, scare you with real information. They'll present you with real information, just do it in a scary way and do it out of context. But anyway, let's move forward. All right, so there's basically a graphic of everything we said. And like I said, you're not going to be tested. Why is it not showing up? It shows up on my end, but not your end. Try it like this. Oh, there we go. That's where I'm at. You can see here, like I said, these are the big 4. These are what you need to know. Know that we're mostly oxygen, carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen. You don't need to know the percentages. You don't need to know that it's mostly oxygen, then carbon, then hydrogen, then nitrogen. You don't need to know that. And you definitely don't need to know all these. But the big 4, I might require you to know that. And like I said on Monday, you're going to get really familiar with those because you're going to be using them a lot in lab. Carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen. All right. Again, hard to see, but I'll just tell you what it says. That says water. So we're about to talk about water, why that's so important for life. And actually, I'm going to try to fix this because I don't like you seeing that. Bear with me, guys. I'm sorry. Technology has not been my friend this semester. Slide. There we go. That should work. All right. So this is not information that you need to know, and it's not your textbook. It's just a good introduction. Like, why do we even care about water? Why are we talking about water? Well, it's important for biology. So, as your old textbook pointed out, life began in water and evolved there about 3 billion years ago. So that's where water started. And if you read that post I put on Facebook about one of the independent work topics you could look up is what's older, this thing or that thing? And one of the examples I used was sharks. Sharks have been around longer than flowers. And that's mostly because obviously sharks are from the water, land, and flowers are not. So anyway, you can look that kind of stuff up if you want. Life is still tied to water, and that's what we're about to talk about, why it's so important. And here's a number you should know for the exam. Cells are about 70 to 95% water. So you yourself are about 70 to 95% water. You need to know that number. So take notes, write that down. Because honestly, that's might be one of those few things that's not in the new textbook, but I want you to know. And it's not going to be tricky. So your options aren't going to be like, because it's multiple choice. I'm not going to give you 65 to 90% or 75 to 100%. It's going to be obviously 70 to 95%. The other choices are going to be completely different. So don't feel like I'm going to be trying to trick you. Anyway, any questions about the slide? All right. So why is it so important? How is it so important? Like I mentioned on Monday, when we were talking about polar molecules and hydrogen bonds, that's mostly it. There's no need to necessarily write that down, but as I'm teaching you just these things, just keep that in the back of your mind. It's the fact that water is a polar molecule, which results in these hydrogen bonds, that actually makes it so important. And there's 4 properties that we're going to learn about. You definitely don't need to write these down yet either, even if you're a note taker, because we're going to talk about these individually. The first thing we're going to talk about is the cohesive nature of water. Then we'll talk about the ability of water to moderate temperatures. Then we'll talk about the biological significance of ice floating. And then finally, the versatility of water as a solvent. So here we go. Let's talk about the cohesion of water first. First of all, does anybody know what cohesion means? What does that mean? When I say water is cohesive, what does that mean? All right. Sticks together, right? Good. Perfect. And you do need to know that. I might ask you that, but yeah. When something is cohesive, it sticks together. I think your book also mentions adhesive, but I'm not going to test you on that. But just so you know, adhesive is when something sticks to something else. So it's cohesion when it's the same thing. When water sticks to water, excuse me, that's cohesion. When a sticky note sticks to a wall, that's adhesion. Anyway, it's those, again, the hydrogen bonding that makes them stick together. And water has more cohesion than most other liquids. How many of you ever rubbed alcohol, like rubbing alcohol on you? Not on a woman, but just like you just got it on you. What's it feel like? Dry. What else? Because yes, I would agree too. What you think? Do you think it feels hot or cool? Cold, right? The reason is because it doesn't have the hydrogen bonding water does. So what happens is basically it's boiling off of you, which I know sounds weird. Because when you think of boiling, you think of water and you think of heat and very hot, right? But basically it's evaporating off of you, and that's why it feels so cool, because it doesn't have as much hydrogen. So it's easier for those molecules to bust away from each other, so to speak. Anyway, so yes, water molecules sticking together is important. The one example your book gives is trees, right? So if you look at a big tall tree, you ever wonder, well, how does the water get there? How does the water get to the very top leaf? Do you guys know? Like, does it just gather it from the rain? Like the leaves just catch it while it falls from the sky? How does it work? Does anybody know? What is it? Yeah, it comes up from the roots, right? Do you know how? Trunk, good enough, yeah. You do not expect to know this. This is not a botany class. But yeah, it's got like little tubules in it, in the cells, in the tree itself, where the water molecules get basically almost pooled up. So imagine the very tip-top leaf, it gets hot, it evaporates, right? A water molecule escapes out of the leaf, but that water molecule that escaped out of the leaf is still hydrogen bonded to another water molecule below it, which is hydrogen bonded to another water molecule, so on and so forth. So it's almost like a chain. So as one escapes, it pulls up the whole chain, and then literally just, when you think about it, just sucks it up, pulls it all up from the bottom, which is really impressive when you think about it, because some trees are really, really tall. Anyway, yes, so as far as your book is concerned, that's the one good example of why cohesion of water is so important. But for independent work, you could look up other reasons. Why else is that important? Why else is it important that water can stick together? So look it up if you could. Oh yeah, I'm sorry, your book does give one example. And in my opinion, it's a little bit less important for our lives. Like other things need this to live, but not necessarily humans. We need this, we need trees to be alive. But surface tension is another one. I'm 95% sure I'm not going to ask you about surface tension. But it is the measure of difficulty and the stretching slack breaking of the surface of a liquid. So like this picture of a spider on the water, that spider's not floating, right? When something floats, it kind of breaks the surface of the water. It's just that it happens to be lighter than the water. So even though it's breaking the surface, it doesn't go all the way in. Surface tension, in this situation, it's not even breaking the surface of the water. And again, it's the hydrogen bonds, right? These water molecules are hydrogen bonded to each other. So it makes it a little bit harder to break those bonds. So you can have surface tension. And you can pool one water molecule and have the rest follow. So any questions about surface tension? Here's a picture. This is not from your textbook. When I first started teaching this course, I forgot which Olympics, but anyway, it was during the Olympics. So I found this picture. It's like, that's a great demonstration of surface tension because the water level is right here, right? So this person's torso and head is above the water level, but you can see when that person took that picture, that great timing picture, there's still water around him. There's the surface tension. He hasn't broken the surface yet. And then one other picture I ran into on accident, and it reminds me of WVSU. So there it is, surface tension. Anyway, any questions about surface tension? All right, the next one is more important in my opinion, especially if you've got Bio 108. This is a very important one. Temperature. Water moderates temperature. But before we can talk about how, let's talk about what temperature is. And you need to know this. It is the measure of the motion of molecules. Not that I'm going to ask you that. So that first bullet point, I'm not going to ask you the definition of temperature. I just need you to understand it when I'm about to explain it. So when I say it's getting hot in this room, what I'm really saying is that the air molecules are moving around faster. That's what I'm really saying. Or if I'm saying it's getting cold in this room, what I'm really saying is the air molecules are moving around slowly, right? So the faster molecules move, the higher the temperature, the slower they move, the lower the temperature. And water is really good at maintaining a temperature. It takes a lot of energy to change the temperature. And I'm not going to ask you all these details. For the exam, you just need to know water is really good. It takes a lot of energy to change the temperature. Water is really good at maintaining its temperature. That's what you need to know. The rest of the stuff I'm telling you is just so you understand why it is that way. So again, the more molecules move around, the hotter they are, right? That's what temperature is. But remember, these things are hydrogen bonded to each other. So imagine if I told you all to stand up. I won't do this, but probably get in trouble for it. If I told you to all stand up and everybody hold hands, we made just like a big circle of everybody hold hands. And I'm like, all right, now just jiggle around as much as you can, like a mosh pit, right? And obviously, the more you're moving, that represents the temperature moving up, and also it probably would actually get hotter. But right, if you're moving around, that's like the water molecules moving around faster and faster, hotter and hotter. But you're still holding hands, so you're kind of limited, right? Until finally you break free and you no longer hold anybody's hands, then you're really free to move around, right? You can do some spins, some rolls, you can bounce all over the room. But while you're still stuck there holding each other's hands, you're kind of limited. Does that make sense? Same with water molecules. So they have those hydrogen bonds. As you apply heat to water, it is heating up. Those water molecules are moving around a little bit more and a little bit more, but they still have those hydrogen bonds. So they're not really free to truly move. Until finally you do give it enough energy, but they do move around a lot. That's more than the point. And that's when the temperature really starts to jump up. Does that make sense? Right? Those molecules are not free to move around. Therefore, you can keep adding temperature, and it takes a really long time to change the temperature. How many of you have seen like somebody who keeps a tea kettle on their stove, and that way when they're done using an eye, they put the tea kettle on there? We do that at our house. I recommend doing it at your house. Reason being is because when you have an empty eye, even though you turn it off, it's still just radiating heat to your kitchen, right? But if you put some water on it, that water is going to absorb the heat. I mean, the water temperature will go up a little bit, but not much because it's absorbing that heat. Of course, that has nothing to do with what keeps us alive, right? Keeping your house cool on the stove has nothing to do with keeping us alive. So let's talk about why this is important. Now that you know how it works, let's talk about why it's important. It's because one of the reasons is without it, we probably just wouldn't have temperatures that would keep us alive, right? We would not be able to live in the temperatures of Earth if it wasn't for water. Generally speaking, water keeps things from getting too hot on Earth and keeps them from getting too cold on Earth. Or as your book says it, the temperatures stay within the limits that permit life. But don't get me wrong, there's some really wild life out there. Some of it can withstand really cold temperatures. Some of it can stand really hot temperatures. But life as we know it would be completely different because we would have those extreme organisms. We wouldn't have the ones we know today. We wouldn't be around them, certainly. The way that works, and again, these 3 bullet points, I'm not going to ask you that. What you need to know is that water helps temperature stay within a level that we can survive. And I'm just letting you know how that happens because water stores heat from the sun during the warm periods. So it kind of absorbs that heat so it doesn't get too hot, which sounds crazy, especially this summer. It's really hot, right? But technically it would be hotter if you didn't have that water absorbing heat. And then after it's been absorbing it, it gives off that heat. When things start cooling off, it gives off that heat. And I'll give you an example of that in the next slide. So yes, how does water moderating temperature affect life? What do you need to know for the exam? That bullet point, right? Not the 3 little bullet points under it. That's just me explaining it. You need to know it helps temperature stay within livable limits. And then the next bullet point you need to know, and it's really simple, I barely even need to explain this, evaporative cooling, aka sweat, right? You get hot, you sweat, you're wet, it heats up, it absorbs the heat that you're putting off, and when it evaporates, that's that cooling sensation. So if you're a little bit sweaty, and you fan yourself, that air wafting across, as it does that, it feels good, it cools you down. But that first bullet point, this one here, we're going to go back to talking about that in a second. Are there any questions so far? Again, these are the 2 bullet points you need to know for the exam. But let's talk about how another way water absorbing heat and then giving it back off, how that also affects our lives. How many of you ever been to a desert? Which one did you go to? Do you remember, or where was it?
Arizona.
Okay, that might be a little bit different. Do you remember when you went?
Probably 14 years ago.
Oh, well, that was a long time. You might not remember the details, but I meant like summer or whatever. But anyway, a lot of times in the desert, what will happen is it gets obviously really hot during the day, and then it get really cold at night, depending on the desert. Some deserts are just always cold. Anyway, one of the reasons is because as the sun's beating down on the desert, there's no water to absorb that heat. Not just on the ground, but in the air, right? It's dry air, it's not humid, so it just gets really, really hot. Then the sun goes down, and there's no water that it absorbed all that heat to put it back off. So it gets really cool at night. Not always, but that's generally speaking, that's how deserts work. That's a little bit less important. Here's a better one. I'll give you an example. Here's West Virginia, right? We're about right here. Here is Iceland. And that's Greenland. Yeah, Iceland. And look at the temperatures, right? So our average temperature in January is a high of 40 and a low of 23. And then way up here in the Arctic Circle, or at least close to it, their average temperature in January is 37 and a high of 37 and a low of 27. So you can see how similar our weather is, our climate, which is insane because look how high they are, look how north they are. So the reason being is because water here at the equator is getting pounded by the sun. It gets really hot. It's moving this way for other reasons that we don't talk about. And then it hits this and it moves north for other reasons we don't talk about. And then it hits that, has nowhere to go, so it goes south. But all this time, as it's going north and colder air, it's still maintaining that heat. It's like a big battery. It just soaked up all that energy. So it's going up there. By the time it's up there, it still has a lot of that energy, so it's putting it off. And Iceland's a little tiny island, so it's surrounded by that water. Anyway, so again, water moderates temperature, keeps things in livable ranges, and also really affects the climate around the earth. So anyway, any questions about this? All right, and you can look stuff like that up if you want to for independent work. Technically, that's not biology we're talking about. It's weather, it's climate, but obviously that affects biology. So you're allowed to look that up. Another thing to mention, sorry, is you'll also notice that like coastal places, they have less temperature fluctuation, like they're high, they're low, than places in the middle of the continent, because the middle of the continent doesn't have that ocean to help moderate temperatures. Anyway, any questions about how water moderates temperatures? All right, here's the other one you need to know. The significance of ice floating, which might sound crazy. Like, what's the matter if ice floats or not? Before we talk about why it's significant, let's talk about how it happens. And this is pretty common sense. Why does anything float? Because it's less dense than the liquid that it's in. So that will be a question, maybe. Why does ice float? It's because ice is less dense than water. And I might ask you that. But again, that should be a very easy question because, like I said, that's the answer to anything. Why does it float? Why does a helium balloon float? The helium is less dense than the air that it's in. Anyway, what makes it less dense? That's what I'm going to show you on the next slide. What makes it less dense? And I might ask you that, but probably not. First thing you need to know is that ice floats. Why it floats, that might be a question on the study guide, but I probably won't ask you on the exam. On the left, we have liquid water. On the right, we have frozen water. It's kind of hard to see because this is blurry, but the artist actually made those molecules blurry as well to signify that they're moving. Yeah, they're hydrogen bonded, but they are still moving around a little bit, right? So they're kind of densely packed. But water is interesting because when it freezes, they separate those molecules, as you can see how close they are versus how far they are. That's what makes it less dense, right? They're farther apart, therefore it's less dense, therefore ice floats in water. But in a way, as far as the exam is concerned, that's a little bit less important. What's more important is why is this important? Or excuse me, why is this important for biology? That's more important for the exam too. Here we go. As a body of water cools, an ice layer forms on top, right? I'm sure you guys have seen that. How many of you are from the South? I forgot. Maybe none of you. You're all from up at least West Virginia or north. Okay, so you guys have all seen ice floating or ice forming on a body of water, right? I'm from the South. I didn't see that for years, but yeah. And you might think, what's that matter? Well, it acts as a blanket. And I know that sounds weird because when you think of ice, you don't think of a blanket, but that is what happens. Because ice, even though it's a solid form of it, it is still water. So it can still resist the change in temperature. So you get a little blanket of ice on the top of the water. It's 0 degrees Celsius or 32 degrees Fahrenheit, whichever one you want to use. And then let's say the air temperature gets really, really, really cold, like I don't know, 0 degrees Fahrenheit or negative 10 degrees Fahrenheit. The air might be really cold, but that blanket of ice is still going to maintain, it's going to stay close to 32 degrees Fahrenheit because it's hard to change the temperature of water. So even though 32 sounds cold to us, it is relatively warm when the temperatures drop a lot lower, much lower than that. Does that make sense? So even though it's cold, it can be relatively warm. And without that, or because of that, things can live under there, right? Again, once again, it's permitting livable temperatures because of the fact that it floats. And obviously, too, if it didn't do that, then everything would freeze solid, and almost no organisms can survive that, which is a good independent work topic if you want to look into it. Which organisms or species can survive being frozen? As far as I know, there's even one frog. Well, I know there's at least one frog species that can be frozen at the autumn. You look it up for independent work if you don't. It's not important, just trivial information that I find interesting. So yeah, water freezing, it helps maintain life because again, basically this should be a subcategory of it. It keeps the temperature ranges livable. And here's an interesting one. You can click on this. I don't remember if it's a video. Check my notes. Yeah, I don't know if that's a video or an article. But again, I'm from the South, and very rarely in Florida do they have freezes, but sometimes they do. Prepare for those freezes. What they'll do is they'll spray water on the trees. They'll mist it or put actual water on the trees. And that's why, because it'll freeze and it'll become ice, which again, I know sounds counterintuitive because like ice is cold, but the ice will help protect it. It will act like a blanket. So when air temperatures get much lower from freezing, you know, the tree maintains its freezing temperature. It's relatively warm temperature. So you can look that up for independent work too if you want. Anyway, any questions about this? Oh man, I haven't done independent or attendance words. If anybody noticed that, you feel free to always remind me. Anyway, let's say the first word for attendance way into the lecture is going to be ice. We're talking about ice. I don't think anyone's online live right now, but if you are, as usual, send me those words sometime before 9 a.m. And for you guys, you can send me the words sometime before 9 a.m. for the lecture credit. Anyway, the last one we're going to talk about why life is so important. Water is the solvent of life. So without water, you can do a lot of things. We're about to talk about a lot of those things. But first you need to know some vocabulary words, which I might or might not ask you on the exam, and I'm definitely going to use them a lot. So you know them. Does anybody know the difference in the relationship between these three words? Solution, solvent, solute. You might tell me that. That's okay. I don't expect you to yet. But here we go. A solution is a liquid with a homogeneous mixture of two or more substances. Now, don't write that down yet. Let me tell you everything before you write it down because I can give you a shorthand. A solvent is something that is doing the dissolving, and a solute is the thing that's being dissolved. So a better way of putting this, in my opinion, is when you dissolve a solute in the solvent, you get a solution. You write that one sentence. That sentence makes sense to you. Because yes, it's a homogeneous mixture of two or more substances, but I don't need to go into all that much detail. You need to know the solvent is the liquid that's dissolving something. The solute is the thing that's being dissolved. And when you dissolve these things, what you're left with is the solution. So if you're making margaritas from scratch and you want some simple syrup and you dissolve some sugar and some water on the stove, the water is the solvent, the sugar is the solute, the solution is simple syrup, which is nothing but sugar dissolved in water. Coffee, right? It's a little bit different, but for the purposes of my work, you mix the beans and the water to get coffee. The beans would be the solute, the water would be the solvent, the solution would be coffee. So again, I might ask you questions to make sure you understand those three terms. But more than likely, or more importantly, I'm going to use those throughout the semester, so you need to understand them when I use them. Anyway, that's what a solution is. And technically, and I've only given you these examples, but when you dissolve something in water as opposed to some other liquid, it's called an aqueous solution. And I'm really not going to ask you that, and I'm probably not even going to use that term again. Because all the solutions that we talked about in this semester, they are aqueous. But anyway, any questions about this slide? All right, as your book says, water can dissolve a variety of solutes. It provides a medium for chemical reactions. No need to write any of this down. This is still just like what was on that last slide was more important. This is just explaining why it works the way it does. And then it gives an example, right? Water dissolves salt. When that happens, each ion becomes surrounded by oppositely charged regions of water molecules, which I'm going to show you on the next slide. That's just an example. You don't need to know this example. Again, what you need to know, what we're talking about right now, is that water is a great solvent. Water is great at dissolving things. And why does it matter? Why do we need to dissolve something? Well, like I said earlier on Monday, when I was talking about how salt, right, sodium chloride, the sodium is an explosive metal, the chloride is a poisonous gas, but together that's something we need. And we do need it. But technically what we don't need, off the top of my head, and I could be wrong, but I really don't think I am. I don't think our cells need salt itself. I don't think our cells ever use sodium chloride. I think what our cells, I know what our cells use, is sometimes they need chloride, sometimes they need sodium, but they never need sodium chloride, as far as I know. So that's why the solvent thing is so important. So if I had a brick of Legos, like red Legos and green Legos, and just one big, just a bunch of them in a big blob, and I gave it to her, and I said, here, I want you to make me a green box. What's the first thing she would do if I gave her just that big, a bunch of them put together, green and red ones, and I gave them to her and said, make me a green box? What would be the first thing you did? You pick out the green ones, right? You have to take it apart, because I didn't give you what you needed. I gave you a bunch of stuff. Same here. So when your body needs chloride or your body needs sodium, sodium chloride is not what it needs, right? It has to dissolve that. And that's just one example. You can look up more. What other stuff do our bodies dissolve? But yeah, that's an example. It's a good example. We need it. Without chloride, without sodium, we would be dead. This is another thing you can look up too for anything. Why do we need chloride? Why do we need sodium? The sodium is the big one. You'll probably get a lot of answers for that. Anyway, any questions about why water is important? We're done talking about why water is important. All right. The next thing we're talking about are acids, bases, and pH. And historically, I think this is probably the hardest part of the chapter for people, because I'm sure you're all familiar with the term acid, base, pH. But now you have to be specific. You need to know specific things about it. All right. That's weird. Anyway, the compound that releases hydrogen ions is an acid. You need to know that. So something's giving off hydrogen ions or H plus. You can see it written either way, anywhere in the textbook, anywhere on the exam, anywhere in the labs. These things mean the same things. Hydrogen ions, H plus. Which, not that you need to know this, but if you're wondering what that means, it's a hydrogen atom that we talked about, right? The one proton, one electron. But it lost its electron, so it's just basically a proton. Anyway, that's what an acid is. That's how your book defines it. That's how we'll define it in this class. For independent work, you can look up the other definitions of acids. There's other ways to define acids. This is the simplified way that we do it in this class. So, what's the opposite of an acid? It's a base. There's two different ways we could think about a base. Well, three. First of all, it is the opposite of an acid. So that being said, one of the ways you can look at it is it accepts those hydrogen ions. Anything that's accepting those hydrogen ions, I shouldn't say anything, but whatever, it's suffice for this one to look, of course. If it's accepting those hydrogen ions, it's a base. But more accurately, at least as far as this course is concerned, they release OH minus ions. So again, if you just take notes, it would be sufficient to write acid equals H plus, base equals OH minus. Because acids put out those H plus ions, bases put out those OH minus ions. And of course, what happens when you put one oxygen, two hydrogens, you get water. I'm probably not going to ask you that, but that's just a little side information. Generally speaking, when you combine a base and an acid, you get water. So any questions before we start talking about pH scale? What an acid is or base is? All right. So again, if I say this liquid has more H plus ions than OH ions, what is it? Then the proper answer would be acidic. If I said this liquid has more OH ions than H plus ions, what is it? You would say it's more basic. Or I can word it a different way. If I were to say this liquid has fewer OH ions than H ions, right? If it has fewer of these than these, then it's basic, right? So think about all the different ways you can describe an acid and a base just off of those two bullet points. That being said, let's make it a little bit more confusing and talk about the pH scale. The pH scale describes acidity. It is the measure of the concentration of H plus in a solution. You don't necessarily need to write that down if you don't want. I'm not going to ask you what is a pH scale. I'm going to give you some questions about the pH scale and have you compare something that's pH 7 versus a pH 4 or whatever. But I'm not going to ask you the definition of a pH scale. But yeah, technically it measures acidity, which to me makes it confusing. I don't want to get into the math of it. But even though it measures acidity, for some reason, well, a reason that I could explain to make things more confusing, the lower the number is, the more acidic it is, and the higher the number is, the less acidic it is. You do need to know that. So again, pH scale, the lower it is, the more acidic, the higher it is, the more basic. Or the lower it is, the less basic, the higher it is, the more basic, right? There's all these different ways you can describe the same thing. The lower it is, the more H plus ions there are. The higher it is, the more OH minus ions there are. The lower it is, the fewer OH minus ions there are. The higher it is, the more OH ions there are. So again, all these different ways to describe it. I'm going to show you on the next slide a picture of what I'm talking about. Hopefully that'll help. The next thing I want to point out, actually the next two slides. Before I go to the next slide, though, I want to point this out. You do need to know this. It's confusing people too. Each unit is a 10 times change of concentration. So when you say something, if you're going from a pH of 4 to a pH of 5, you know, it's not like that's just one. 5 is one more than 4. In this case, it's 10 more than 4. If you go from 4 to 5 to 6, right, that's 2 steps. So 10 there, 10 there. So something with a pH of 6 is 100 times more basic than a pH of 4 because each step is 10. And if you even go from 4 up to 7, right, and we have another 10, right, add another 0 there, that's 1,000 times more acidic. So each step is a factor of 10. You need to know that. And again, acid at the bottom, base at the top. I'm going to come back to this, but I want to show you a picture of it. And then come back to it. Here's another picture, not from your textbook. You could say this is basic because look, it has more OH than H plus, or OH minus than H plus. This one's neutral because it has the same amount of each. This one's acidic because it has more H plus than OH minus. So that's a visualization of what I've already told you. And then here's the pH scale. So again, I'm not going to ask you the definition of a pH scale, but I will give you a picture like this, and I will ask you questions. You will need to use this to answer questions. Because I might say something like, you know, how much more basic is ammonia than seawater? And you have to look at it and estimate, like, all right, seawater looks like it's about 9. Ammonia looks like it's about 12. So 9 to 10, that's 1 step. 10 to 11, that's 2 steps. 11 to 2, that's 3 steps. So 10, 100, 1,000. So the answer is household ammonia is about 1,000 times more basic than seawater. Or seawater is about 1,000 times more acidic than ammonia. So again, there's nothing to memorize here. You don't have to memorize all this stuff. But you need to be able to use this if I give it to you and ask a question. The pH will be really important later in the semester, not to this level. So I'm going to show you, you might have one question where I ask you to do that on the exam. But that'll be it. Probably just one, maybe 2 questions. This is sort of important. It's really important that you understand pH in general. At this level of understanding, it's a little bit deeper than what's really important for the rest of the semester. But if you understand it at this level, then you'll definitely understand the more broad concepts, which is what you need to know later in the semester. pH will be important later in the semester. Anyway, any questions about this? All right, going back to chemophobia and people trying to scare you. I love this one. This one was a joke, but I found this on in the wilds of the internet. But this little meme right here. Dihydrogen monoxide is an acid with a pH level of 7. That is the highest pH. No, you can't read it. It says that is the highest pH level than any other acid. I wish I could hide that. Oh, there I can. So what I love about this, even though it's a joke, is it's a good example of how people can tell you something that's true, but try to make it sound scary. But if you have some science literacy and you learn this basic science, then you can look past this crap. Now, granted, we normally don't teach you what dihydrogen monoxide is, but does anybody know what dihydrogen monoxide is?
Water.
Yeah, right. Dihydrogen, so 2 hydrogens, monoxide, 1 oxygen, so H2O. It's an acid with a pH level of 7. It's all relative, right? So you could, in a sense, call anything an acid if it has more H plus than something else. But what you know now, actually I didn't say this, so I'm glad I'm talking about this. What you do need to know, another thing that I didn't mention earlier, you need to know that 7 is neutral. So I did say the lower it is, the more acidic it is, the higher it is, the more basic it is. So even though I didn't explicitly state it here, that should have been applied, but pH level is 7, right there in the middle, that's basic. Anyway, dihydrogen monoxide is an acid with a pH level of 7. That's the highest pH level of any other acid. And I guess you could look at it that way, right? Once you get anything past 7, you could argue that we're talking about something basic. So yeah, trying to look scary, and in all actuality, it's just a basic fact of life. You can go on and on with stuff like that. You know, everybody I know who died in the Marines has ingested dihydrogen monoxide at least the day before. Pretty scary stuff, right? They put this stuff in your vaccines. I heard they even put it in some of the foods at the cafeteria. Don't tell anybody I told you that, but yeah, it's all over the place. Anyway, any questions about that? I'm obviously not going to test you on that. But oh, that is a good independent work topic. That's going to require a lot of thinking and a lot of investigation. But try to find stuff like that, whether it be on social media or wherever else. Try to find people like trying to scare you about something, and then dive into it and see if it actually is legitimately scary or if it's just nature described in a scary way. Anyway, let me back up one slide before we go to the next slide. And I mentioned this on Monday. I think I did. So our water, our blood pH, right about 7, right? It needs to be about 7.4. A little bit too high, it'll kill you. A little bit too low, and it'll kill you. Another good independent work topic. How high is too high? How low is too low? But like I asked on Monday, well, let's see, we'll change it a little bit. How many of you have had coffee today? Yeah, me too. I'm doing it right now. How many of you have ever had coffee? All right. How many of you have ever had tomato juice? Like V8 or something. How many of you ever had grapefruit juice or a soft drink? Right? How many of you ever had lemon juice? Right? How many of you ever chugged battery acid? No, I'm just kidding. No, I hope not. But the point is, look at that. Like this is deadly. These are deadly pHs, yet you drink them all the time, right? Usually people don't drink that stuff. But the point is, we can drink acidic stuff and basic stuff because our body can handle it. Because, and this is what I'm getting at, the term you need to know for the exam, is we have something called a buffer. Buffers are substances that minimize the change in pH. Write that however you want. What you need to know about a buffer is it buffers the changes in acidity or alkaline. Right? It doesn't change. Sort of like water helps temperature not change much. Buffers help the pH not change much. So you can drink your battery acid and then take it with a shot of bleach. I'm just kidding. Don't do that. But you can have some lemon juice and be just fine. How does it work? I might not ask you this, but it doesn't matter because what you do need to know for test questions is remember, something acidic has a bunch of H plus ions. Something basic has a bunch of OH minus ions. So just think about a buffer must do the opposite. If you add a bunch of acid to it, it's going to take those H plus ions. If you add a bunch of base to it, it's going to give off H plus ions. So again, I probably won't necessarily ask you these two things, but the information to figure that out is something you do need to know. Acids give off H plus ions. So anyway, yeah, that helps us survive. That's another thing we're talking about. When people try to sell you alkalized water, it's just a bunch of garbage. It might taste good, sure, but it's not going to do anything for your health. It's all going to get neutralized in your belly. Once you drink it, it's all the same. But like when Gwyneth Paltrow, I remember seeing one thing where she sells it, right? She sells it. She's like, I like to drink my alkalized water with a little spritz of lemon juice in it. I'm like, well, you just neutralize it right there. You have acid and base, so it's not alkalized anymore, is it? Anyway, any questions about buffers? All right, buffer will be the next attendance word. Buffer. Then we can jump into the next big topic, the third and final of the big topics this chapter. If you can't read this, I can read it to you. We've already talked about the building blocks of molecules. Excuse me. We're going to talk about that. We talked about water. Now we're going to talk about biological molecules. And again, it's going to be hard to read, but I'm going to fix this and put it online for you. But what this says, obviously, I'm not going to test you on this necessarily, but the learning objectives of this are you should be able to describe the ways in which carbon is critical to life. Obviously, easy to read, right? Explain the impact of slight changes in amino acids on organisms, which we're going to talk about in detail. Describe the four major types of biological molecules, which we're going to talk about in detail, and you're going to have a whole lab on it. So you should be very familiar by the end of the lab. And finally, understand the functions of the four major types of molecules. So let's move forward. Stuff you need to know. Let's talk about organic compounds in general. As you already know, because I told you there was a number that you needed to know. Does anybody remember what the number is? Cells are mostly how much water? Good, 70-95%. Or as this part of the textbook says, mostly water. No doubt, mostly water. This is obviously a fake picture. So if they're mostly water, what about the rest of them? The rest of the cell content, like when you remove the water, consists mainly of carbon-based molecules. Don't need to write that down. This is like an introduction. Basically, everything I'm about to tell you, they're almost all carbon-based molecules. Not that you need to, that's not going to be a test question. Again, this is an introduction. Why carbon-based? Well, carbon forms large, complex, diverse molecules. And I'm going to really dive into that bullet point later, so there's no need to write that down. And these things are called organic compounds or macromolecules. And you certainly don't need to write that down. I'm not going to ask you the definition of what a macromolecule is. Just know that everything I'm about to teach you, these are macromolecules. Anyway, so that's the introduction to what we're about to talk about. Any questions about the slide? All right, let's dive back into carbon. Why are all these carbon-based? Carbon is a very versatile molecule. What you do need to know from this and you're not going to forget this after we do lab next week. I mean, we're going to do lab this week, but this lab we're going to do next week. Carbon makes 4 covalent bonds, as I explained earlier. That is actually an important thing because it can make 4 bonds, which is more than most. You just have to think of a 3-dimensional puzzle, right? Carbon, 1, 2, 3, 4, can bond to 4 different things. If you had something that could only bond to 3 things, you have fewer options. If you have something that can only bond to 2 things, you have fewer options. If you have something that can only bond once, you have fewer options. Right? So the more times you can bond, the more variety you can get in your molecule. And because of that, carbon can make an endless diversity of carbon skeletons that vary in their size, their branching patterns. You don't need to write any of that down. This is all an introduction. This next slide, I'm going to show you just a few examples of different size and branching patterns. So here's a carbon, right? Here's a small straight line of 2 carbons, right? That's 1 molecule. This one's a little bit longer, still just a bunch of carbons bonded to each other. This one happens to have a double bond, but still pretty simple. This one is a little bit less simple because yes, it's linear like the other 2, but it also goes up that way. And then this one formed a ring, right? You don't even know any of these. These are just examples. The point here is because carbon can bond 4 times, and this is still 4 bonds, by the way, 1, 2, 3, 4. Because it can bond 4 times, it can do all these different shapes, all these different size molecules. So that's why most molecules we look at are carbon-based. Not that I'm going to ask you why they're carbon-based. This is just for your own knowledge. Your book pointed this out, so I'm bringing it up again. Carbon can bond with other elements, most commonly hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen. So like I said, when we were talking about the different elements, those are the big 4, and you should know those. Big 4. You're mostly made up of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. I already said that back again. If I remember correctly, as a matter of fact, your textbook didn't even mention the big 4 until this portion of the chapter. So when we were talking about elements, I don't even think they talked about the big 4. Because like I said earlier, that was not in your textbook. But it is now. Your book gives an example. That's going to be on the next slide. Methane, CH4. That's probably the most common, basic example. It's just 1 carbon bonded to 4 hydrogen. You don't need to know this. It's just an example. Yeah, and your book points out that it's abundant in natural gas. How was it made? It's made by prokaryotes. As far as we're concerned, that's bacteria. So swamp gas, right? That stuff that stinks, that's where it comes from. It also comes from the digestive tracts of grazing animals, like cows, right? Cows can't break down grass, so they have bacteria in the bellies that can. And when they do that, they produce CH4 methane. And again, you don't need to know that. Here's some more pictures. You saw something similar on Monday. You do not need to know these pictures. Again, I just want to point out that these are the same thing. There's different ways of drawing molecules. So if you're studying something and it looks like this in your textbook, and then you want to look it up on the internet, and it looks like this or this, just know that's okay. It's normal, right? You just have different ways of drawing it. So that's it with carbon in general, or excuse me, specifically carbon itself. So let's just talk about larger molecules in general, especially carbon molecules. This is a good example. You don't need to write any of this down, but this is a great example of structure and function, right? So some of these larger organic compounds are the main molecules of gasoline, right? That's what octane looks like. And this is what dietary fat looks like. And even if you're not a chemist or a dietitian or a biologist, you can just look at this and think, wow, this thing looks like 3 of these things put together, right? And in a sense, it's very similar. It does very similar things. We break this down in the presence of oxygen, which is going to be a whole chapter. We break that down in the presence of oxygen. That releases energy, and that's what keeps us alive. We break this down in the presence of oxygen. That releases energy, and that energy helps move our vehicles. But chemically, it's very similar. It's breaking something down. We're breaking those bonds in the presence of oxygen to release the energy. And again, there's going to be a whole chapter on that. Anyway, nothing here to write down yet. This is still an introduction. I guess the next word for attendance can be gasoline. Since we have a can of gasoline over here. To focus on this a little bit more, the next picture I'm going to show you is another picture, just a picture of those 2 molecules right next to each other. Up at the top is octane, and this is one. Remember the saturated fat looked like this, like a blob here, and the three things. Well, this is one of those three things, right? So again, you can see, even without being a chemist, without being a biologist, you can just look at these things and say, wow, those things look so very similar. And very often, when we're talking about these things, especially in the scores, when something looks similar, they very often have a similar function. Speaking of functions, the unique properties of all these different carbon molecules I talked about depend on the carbon skeleton and basically the stuff attached to the carbon skeletons, which brings me to a word that I might ask you, that you definitely need to know because I'm going to use it, a functional group. A functional group is a group of atoms that are directly involved in chemical reactions. And of course, like we're talking about carbon stuff here, right? So obviously, with that being said, these are the things that are attached to those carbon skeletons. They all play a role in chemical reactions, and a lot of biological molecules have two or more of them. Like I said, I probably won't ask you these questions, but if I do, I'm almost definitely not going to answer that last bullet point. Yeah, many biological molecules have two or more, whatever. Basically, you need to know these are things that are attached to the carbon skeleton, and they're important because they change the chemistry of it, right? They change how these things function. Hence the name functional group, right? Because you might have two molecules that have the same exact carbon skeleton. And one might have functional group A, the other one might have functional group B, and because of that, they act completely different, chemically speaking. And that will be important later in the semester. The next slide I'm going to show you, I don't believe it's from your textbook, so I'm not going to ask you any of those. It's nothing to memorize. It's just a good example of some different functional groups. Before I show you that, are there any questions about what's on this slide? All right. Oh, shoot, it's 8:51. I'm sorry. You guys tell me when it's too late, too. So the last word for attendance is late. I was late. If you guys want to take pictures, I guess we'll do it outside because people are waiting to come in. So I need one person to take the picture, and whoever wants to be in it. And all those people will get extra credit. I apologize for keeping you a minute late.